Okay. Uh, I always like seeing that cat photo. Okay, we have a couple of things as announcements or, informational stuff before we get to tonight's topic, which is the remaining Gothic architecture slide. And two things before I give you a little context. First, about last week's lecture, as some of you recall, if you were here last week, you probably all do. That is that I ran out of storage space on my laptop. I hadn't been keeping track of it, so I've cleared out a whole bunch. And what I did was uh, make a second recording for the part that didn't record. Only the first 35 minutes of that lecture recorded, and so the second half is labeled literally Part Two, Gothic Architecture. And so that would be the easiest way to do it. If you missed last week or for any reason need to want to, of course, to review for the final, you will want to take a look at both the lectures, last week's and this week's on Gothic architecture, because I can guarantee there'll be at least one Gothic church slide on the final. Okay. In fact, let's go ahead and get the speaker going here. And also just, in general for your information, because some of these buildings are so iconic, like Notre Dame in Paris. So if you missed that lecture, or, perhaps came in late, or left early, whatever, it's on, as always, by Friday night. I think it was, I recorded the second half. Well, it's more than that, it's 45 minutes. So I had it together. It's only 80 minutes because that's the entire lecture period. I didn't obviously need to record a break. And so that will go, is already that part one and part two. So you should see them together. And that will complete the information we covered last week, which includes a diagram. And that's really maybe the most helpful single thing in the Gothic topics of Gothic architectural the lectures I'm doing, is a chart I drew of the five main features that could come up of Gothic churches. Those could come up in the true false section of the final. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing is about grades. As I know some of you are, and I want to say I appreciate the patience that everyone in this class and most of my other students over the last 2 semesters we've been doing these remote teaching lectures have been displaying. I appreciate the patience you've shown about getting your papers back. I try to get them all back in 2 weeks. I didn't make a hard and fast promise. I used to. When we taught in person, I was able to keep that promise because it was much easier. I handed off the ones I didn't grade to my readers, then they kept back to me within 10 days. And then I had time to check their work and if need be, make minor alterations. By the way, here's my policy. I've said this before, but just in case you didn't know, and some of you already know this because I already sent back 60% of the ones graded by a reader that I've had the longest and the ones I graded. But the other 40%, I'll explain what those aren't ready to return yet, but they will be soon. So the bottom line is that if I send you an email or have sent you an email and your grade went up a little because I decided that the reader was a little stricter than I would have been, I would give you the benefit of the extra few points and it might raise your grade, letter grade, but it's the points that count, right? So I explained that in the tagline, and then you can see what the reader had done, and then put the two numbers together. If the readers, as most of the readers' work is perfectly acceptable and correct, and I just leave it at that, and you can see their corrections and the points totals on the cover sheets for your papers. So about 15, I think it is, or 16 of you who sent yours in on time have gotten the back. The other 10 or 11 or so I should have soon. And the only explanation I can give you is I think it's a reasonable one. It's not, I don't believe, a made up excuse. That reader, she and her boyfriend together got their first shot. She works at the casino. I can never remember the name of it, the new one up north of off the 101 in Santa Rosa. So she had to get her shots, and she got her second one and her boyfriend at the same time, and they both were just knocked out. I don't mean literally unconscious, but unable to function normally for 3 days. It was just the way it hit their particular immune systems. I only had a little fatigue, but they both just weren't able to go to work and or do class assignments, including the grading. So those are being graded as we speak. And I will send you guys each one of those that I get back within 24 hours or less after I get them, probably the same day. But it could be as late as Saturday morning before I can do that, or Saturday during the day. Certainly over the weekend, I should be able to get you all the remaining papers. Now, if you turned yours in late, a few people have, or haven't yet turned yours in, you still can. You only get 10 points off. It's now over a week past the deadline. It doesn't go up, remember? The deduction for late points is only maxed or capped at 10 points, one letter grade. You can make that up with extra credit. Those papers will be coming in, dribbling into me, one at a time, of course, and I'll just send them back as I get them, probably within 48 hours, and I'll grade those. So those will be returned, within a couple of days, work days. If they happen to come in on the weekend, you might have to wait till the following Tuesday, because I do need some family time, like everyone does, on the weekends. Okay, another quick statement, just for those of you who went to the De Young and saw the Frida Kahlo exhibit. I think several of you, or a few in this class, said you did. I went with my daughter. I finally cajoled her into going by, offering to treat her to lunch and a milkshake and fries afterwards. It was a come on. I hate to say that. I love art museums and exhibits at, special ones, especially at any museum that is, accessible. And now, of course, the museums are all open again. The Legion of Honor wasn't open. Well, oops, it opens on Friday. So that'll be the last Bay Area museum to open. I don't know why they took longer. Because San Francisco's in the yellow tier, right? The yellow zone, meaning everything is pretty much back to normal with some minor crowd limits on large gatherings. But museums are at 50% capacity. Well, guess what? First of all, they didn't enforce that. The masks, yes, everyone was wearing masks, but it was so crowded. My daughter, who's only half, she got her first Pfizer shot and will get her second one on the 11th. She was a little uncomfortable. She was concerned about being so close in such a small space. It was one of the smaller galleries. But the other point that was somewhat of a disappointment, there were hardly any of her paintings there. There were only a few paintings. It was mostly photographs and dresses. And that's the part that my daughter and I found the most interesting. Actual dresses she wore in some of her self-portraits. Those were the real thing, not replicas. And that was really interesting. The photographs are mostly by her father, who was a good photographer, but that's not what people went to see. At least I didn't. I wanted to see her paintings. There was not the portrait of thorn necklace. There wasn't the two Fridas, the ones that students mostly write papers about when they write papers about Frida Kahlo paintings, or all the ones she painted on her honeymoon, except the one that the museum already owns, which I thought the whole point of the exhibit was they were going to borrow paintings from museums all over North America, where her work is, mostly Mexico, of course. And that isn't what there was there. So it felt like I did after the King Tut exhibit. Some of you have mentioned that. The one that was here in the Bay Area about 5 years ago, completely bait and switch is what I call it. They charge you the full amount and they tell you you're going to see all this great stuff. And then at the Tut exhibit, there was nothing about him. It was all other things in his tomb, but his coffin, his sarcophagus, his gold mask, and of course his mummy, none of that was there. So this was similar. But anyway, I'm glad I went, because it was still nice to get back inside a Bay Area museum after more than 13 months. So now you've got the other museum exhibits, and I recommend you go to see the one on Picasso and Calder. Calder is the greatest American sculptor of the 20th century. Absolutely brilliant. Invented most of the 20th century styles of sculpture that you've seen or heard of. And a humanitarian. He'd give money to students when they were struggling, art students, of course, anonymously, to help them with their rent stuff. Not a lot of people. Picasso never did that. Most other famous artists don't do that. So Picasso, we all know enough about him. So the two of them are compared and contrasted. So I'm looking forward to seeing that, probably the end of finals week. It leaves on, I think, the 27th of May. So if you want to see it, you've got till the end of this semester for extra credit. Okay, enough announcements. Any questions anybody have about anything relating to grades, extra credit, or your papers? I'll remind you of the extra credit options at least twice more, probably this next week or so, after I've sent all the papers that I'm awaiting from my readers to those of you who turn them in on time. Then maybe a couple, 3 days later next week, I'll send you a summary again of the options, the extra credit options. I think you all know, I'm not going to repeat them now. And then one more time right before finals, because that might be when it's most important, is then you'll know, how many points you need to get the grade you want. And you can get a sense of, well, you can guess if you think you did well on the final, maybe you don't need extra credit, but it doesn't hurt to have that extra margin. Okay, tonight I think we can end extra early. If no one objects, if we do what we did last week, I think we did. Did we do that? Yeah, we did. We can just go right on through the must-knows, because the list is not that long, and not take a break and end about an hour early. Maybe give or take 10 minutes. So does nobody objects, right, to do it that way? Then we can all, have more time after the class is over for other things. Okay, so we'll do it that way. And next week, probably we can do the same thing, but it isn't as clear to me, because what I really want to do is clarify, as some people will need to, that we're not going to have a full review, because you can do that with the videos on YouTube that I've already posted. But the last week of classes before the final, right, 2 weeks from tonight, is the review. You want to be here for that. And that night we almost certainly can end early. But I would like to finish up, I need to finish up next week with Gothic painting and Gothic sculpture, two different topics that aren't the same as architecture, of course, topics in Gothic churches, which is what we're finishing tonight. And then show you my own slides of Notre Dame from the gargoyle's eye view, literally at the top of the two towers, where you can walk back and forth between them, just like Quasimodo did, if you ever seen any of the film versions of the Hunchback of Notre Dame. 220 feet above the streets of Paris. It's an incredible view from there and experience. And the gargoyles are right at your eye level. You're literally looking right at them, and they're looking back at you. And they're, of course, hundreds of years old, images of demons. So I'll show you those slides at the end of next week. And we'll probably still end a bit early, but we might need to take a break. But if we do, it'll be an early break, and we'll still end early. Okay, one more time. Anybody have any questions about anything that I've just mentioned, or anything I didn't bring up regarding grades or extra credit? Okay, let's get to our first must know. First, let me get this. All right. Oops, I didn't want to do that. All right, let's get to screen sharing. And this first must know. Okay, we'll do the hide the thumbnail. There we go. Get this out of here and make this full screen. There we go. Oh, everyone can see this, I assume. Okay, so this is our first must know for tonight. And it is Reims, R-E-I-M-S. It's a city in France. Reims, R-E-I-M-S, Cathedral. The title, the location, of course, France, and the date is 1428. So we have a couple more new definitions. They're not long ones tonight. I think it's 3 actually, but they're mercifully short one-sentence definitions. And that first definition on the list of terms to know, of course, applies to this church. Okay, so let's do that right now. I'll give you that definition about halfway down the page on all the Gothic terms from last week and this week. It's underneath the 5 main features of Gothic churches. Okay, flamboyant style. Flamboyant style. Okay, so here's that definition. It's a style of late Gothic architecture in France from circa 1300 to 1550. So it's a latter period of Gothic. You don't have to know the years. I'm just giving you that as part of the context. Again, I'll say the first part. A style of late Gothic architecture in France from circa 1300 to 1550, which used ornate flame-like decorations along the exterior, which used ornate flame-like decorations along the exterior. We say exterior is plural because, of course, it applies to hundreds of churches throughout France, including this one. So the word, by the way, the French word flamboyant is in English translates to flame-like. And there's a good reason why they chose that term, but let's discuss the meaning and that'll make sense as we go through that, the features of what about this building makes it flamboyant style. But first, as always, what is the main point of this church? It was the site for the coronations of all the kings of France for centuries. You can just say centuries. There was an earlier church here, and it was torn down or burned down. I probably burned down and was replaced by this Gothic cathedral. So just say this city, Reims, it's in northern France, was the site where all the kings of France were crowned for actually over 1,000 years. You could just write it that way, or just say for several centuries. Right up through the last one, the guy that got his head chopped off, right, Louis the 16th. So all the kings of France for several hundred years or over 1,000 years were crowned in this city. And most of them were in this cathedral because, of course, when it was finished, this is where they did the coronation ceremonies for all the kings from then till the French Revolution. So that's one thing that makes it important. Another is that it is in the birthplace, this cathedral, and the city around it is the birthplace, well, not the church itself, but the city, I meant to say the location, is the birthplace of Champagne. Kind of important for anyone who enjoys that particular type of libation. Obviously, Champagne is something we think of as universal, right? The French invented it, and they claim no one makes champagne but them. They're super, you know this, some of you, if you have connections to the wine country, and I do just because I used to write about wine. The point is that, you know, they say that's the only champagne is what's made in France. It was invented beneath the streets, quite literally. You see the cobblestone streets here? In caves underneath the cathedral. So you could say the cathedral is kind of the site of, or over the site of the birthplace of Champagne. About 400 years ago, early 1600s, you'll have to know that fact, was the first champagne, was accidentally invented by monks, priests. And from that point on, of course, it's become one of the most popular drinks, alcoholic drinks anyway, in the world. And this is where it started. So that's another fact about the context of the meaning of this. But the main point to know about is the style of it. We already know what makes something Gothic if you were here last week. And if not, you definitely want to see that lecture that's on YouTube. It has all 5 of the features, so I'm going to briefly describe those, recap, and then I will, not need to take as much time on the next few Gothic church slides after this. But as a refresher of B for those who weren't here last week, those features are pointed arch doors, right, and windows. You see, here's the entryway. You could say entries, but I just say doorways. Pointed arch doorways and windows. These are the windows, obviously above the doors proper, but that whole thing, of course, would be a doorway. Pointed arch doors, you can just keep it simple, and windows is the first feature to look for. A rose window is the second one. Again, this is in that chart, all these 5 features that I drew an illustration of. Since I don't want to go back and recap that, you can see that in the recording. The rose window, the large round stained glass window, every Gothic cathedral and almost all Gothic churches, whether they're cathedrals or not. Remember, a cathedral is one where the bishop presides. So it's the most important Catholic church in any city. So this is a cathedral. And so there's your rose window in the middle. And then let's go out a bit and see tall tapering towers with a spire. Well, there isn't a lot of a spire, much of a spire, in fact, here. But they do taper in 3 parts, actually. It's a bit unusual. I'll explain why. And that has to do with this particular kind of Gothic architecture, the flamboyant version of Gothic. But we'll get to that in a minute. So tall towers with tapering spires, it may seem minor. I mean, almost like they barely do, but they do. And then the other 2 features you can't see in this slide are the flying buttresses, the kind of, you can sort of see the edge of one of them, where they detach from the wall and they support it. A buttress, of course, is a support for any other part of a building or structure of any kind. So the flying buttresses are around the back and the sides. And then we have finally the interior, which you don't have to be concerned with, because you can't see that, and I don't have a slide of the interior of this church. Whereas where the Gothic, the fifth feature, marking this as Gothic style church, is the Gothic groined vaulting on the ceiling. And we saw that again last week with the interior of a couple other churches. We'll see some more Gothic groined vaulting tonight. If it's not clear or you missed last week's lecture, you'll be clear by the end of this evening what that means. Okay, a couple more facts about it. What makes it flamboyant, which is a type of Gothic? Well, look carefully, and if you really notice, especially on the main point here, above the central or middle doorway, right? There are literally flames licking their way. I mean, that's how the architects intended this church to look. Flames or flame-like decorations, of course, made out of stone. So obviously they're just a kind of a strange version of what might not seem like flames to some people, but back in the Middle Ages, that was what people thought of when they looked at this. They were also, to a lesser degree, visible on the sides here. You see them there. You see where my arrow is pointing there, where the cursor. And then they're also at the top of the towers. There's a flame-like effect just around the edges of each of these peaks or each of these points. So the whole idea is that somewhere, not the entire facade, but in several parts of the outside or exterior of a flamboyant style Gothic church, the French architects designed them, and they were the bishops, remember, were the architects. The bishops designed them to look like they had flames licking up parts of the outside of the building. Now, why would they do that? That's the other half of that part of the meaning, of course, is what the idea behind that was. Well, it was the fact that this period of history, especially in France, but all over Europe, was a horribly bad time for almost everybody, except, of course, the ruling classes. There was 100 Years' War. You don't have to write all this. You could just say there was war, famine, and plague. That's enough. Any one of those three things will cause suffering in mass quantities. Literally a third of Western Europe died, a third of the population. So as bad as this pandemic we've had is, where 2.5 to 3% of the people that get the infection die from it, it's nowhere near as bad as the Black Death. You've heard of that, right? Or bubonic plague is, I think, the other word. You could just say there were many plagues, and one particular one, it was called the Black Death, so you might want to write that, was the worst. And that, in this time this church was being built and designed and constructed, these kind of horrible events were happening all over Western Europe, at least, and certainly worse in France. They got hit with the plague even worse than the rest of Europe. And they had a war with England that lasted 100 years. It was called the 100 Years' War. So tens of thousands of people died from in each year or so of those 100-year war. And then you had, of course, droughts and hunger, famine. It was just not a good time to be a poor or, non-wealthy person. So the people turned to religion is the bottom line. That's the last part of the meeting you should have in your notes, is that people would look to the church. I don't mean the building, I mean the institution of the Catholic Church, for some kind of, hope that life would be better, if not on this planet, in this life, when they went, supposedly, if you believe in that, of course. If when you die, you get to go to heaven, then obviously things have to get better there. So a lot of people were just thinking of this life as hardly bearable, but you get through it if you continue going to church and praying and do all the things that the Catholic Church told people to do. Then they were told to believe that they'd get to go to a better place, heaven, of course, after they die. So the flames were symbolic of their religious passion. That's what it really is symbolic of, or religious fervor that people in all of the major Catholic countries. Remember, there was no Protestant. All of Western Europe was Catholic back then. This is before the Protestant Revolution. So the Catholic Church was, in essence, showing that they understood the suffering of the people, though they weren't necessarily doing a lot to alleviate it, but they nonetheless were sympathetic enough to show the evidence of it in their architectural designs on their churches, not just the cathedrals. Almost all the cathedrals built in the late Gothic period in France were in that style, flamboyant. But even some smaller churches and even some town halls. In fact, Bordeaux, France, where really great wine is made, Bordeaux has a town hall, we call it City Hall today, that has a flamboyant style facade with flames licking up the side of it. And it's because the religious fervor carried over into their civic or political institutions too. But it was always present on these churches from around 1300, early 1300s through the early 1500s. Okay, I will mention one more thing. This church actually survived World War I and World War II with minimal damage. Bombing raids happened all around it, but this church somehow was spared, maybe by luck. I'm not sure if it was conscious or deliberate on the part of the Allies, right, that we were fighting Germany, not to hit this church. Probably, it was probably a conscious decision. But nonetheless, damage occurred. The stained glass windows were blown out by explosions nearby. You know, that obviously shrapnel, it's called. So just say that there was damage. It's the last line. If you want to add this, then we'll do the formal analysis about the meaning now. That this building's windows, this church or cathedral's windows, most of them were lost. By the end of World War II, they were damaged, so badly damaged they had to be replaced. And guess what they did? Not what you would expect. They did not just recreate them. They knew what they looked like. There were color photographs by then. And there were people who remembered what the windows looked like or even repaired them over the previous few decades. They chose not to recreate the old medieval windows. They hired Marc Chagall. I think some of you know who he was. One of the greatest painters of the 20th century. He was French Jewish. He'd left France, luckily for him, when Hitler took over. He got out in time or he wouldn't have survived. He came back after the war and he was hired to design modern windows, mid-20th century stained glass details are in the windows. It's a bizarre contrast. When you walk inside, you got this, it's beautiful inside this church. And then you look up the windows all around you, the colored stained glass windows, and they don't look anything like the Gothic architecture and decorative details. So they're modern, mid to late 20th century. I think it took 20 years to replace them. By Marc with a C, Chagall. It's like it sounds with an Chagal. You could add that. You don't have to know that for the exam if it's on the final. Okay, so let's do the formal analysis. It is completely symmetrical. The usual case with most Gothic churches, and especially French Gothic, is, of course, that it's symmetrical. So it's balanced left to right and weighted toward the bottom, of course, because of the narrow towers. So that makes it unbalanced toward the bottom. And then we have the rhythm of the Gothic pointed arches and the statues and the flame-like, or you could just say flamboyant detailing, as well as the windows above the doors. By the way, it has 3 portals. I mentioned this last week, but some of you probably didn't hear that lecture, as I assume is the case. So I should mention 3 doors on a Catholic church are symbolic of the Holy Trinity, which means there are 3 holiest figures in the Catholic Church. And that's God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. So this, as do all Gothic cathedral, I'm sorry, all Catholic cathedrals, I meant, whatever style, not just Gothic, all Catholic cathedrals have 3 doors leading into the entrance, at least the most recent, up until maybe 30 years ago when they start getting Frank Gehry to design some of their churches. But anything before about the turn of this century, they're going to have, whatever style, if it's Catholic cathedral, it's going to have 3 doors. It's called a triportal. So that creates rhythm. And of course, those are dynamic. In fact, the only thing stable, everything, the rose windows dynamic, the flame-like decorations, the tapering, small though they are, tower, spire at the top that ends up with a curve. So those are dynamic, but the edges of the building, of course, the sides of the towers and the walls are stable. There's only natural modeling from the shadows of the sun, of course. Here, the line is all carved everywhere, above the doorways, on the statue, the windows. The textures are all real smooth glass, real rough wood on the doors, and real rough stone on the walls. The largest mass I would say it's both towers. They're equal. And then the central or middle section. The facade is the entire exterior. I think I've said that a few times. It's a good word to know. You don't have to know it to get an A on the final, but it's this entire exterior that you see when you first enter a building. It's the whole front, right? In fact, that's what it really means. Facade is another word for the front of a building. And so that, of course, could be considered one mass. But if you broke it down, you'd have to say the largest masses, they're equal, are the two towers. Remember, towers go to the ground, fall the way from the foundation up, and then the central facade. And for space, the two towers are about 240 feet high. They're about the same height as Notre Dame's tower. It's very similar. I know it looks a little like Notre Dame. For some people, that'll confuse you. So we'll see. I might cut. I'm not saying I will, because we'll do that when we do the review 2 weeks from tonight. We'll cut the list of slides to know the list from the syllabus, the study list, down by 40%. But for now, assume this could be on the exam. So the actual dimensions to wrap up the formal analysis, the towers are about 240 feet high, might be close to 250, so say nearly 250 feet, slightly taller than Notre Dame. And the nave is about 140 feet, about the same as the height of the one at Notre Dame. That's pretty tall. 14-story skyscraper could fit inside the main aisle there. Okay, let's move on to the next detail. Let's see. I may or may not have given you a break on whether this on the syllabus, this next slide. Let's see. Okay. I'm just flipping ahead to the next page. Yeah, I decided to give you guys a break on note taking. So just, we won't do obviously a full detailed discussion, let alone a formal analysis on this. But I did want to show you there are exceptions. Just like everything else in the history of art, there are exceptions to the rules or to the norm, if you want to say, of any style of art or any period of art. Remember what I said last week? That one was actually on. There is a piece of Gothic sculpture, on last week's syllabus, and of course in the lecture as it was recorded and posted on YouTube. So you should look at that, because most Gothic sculpture is stiff and formal, where there's no lifelike qualities, there's no liveliness, there's no movement, almost none. Emotion, very little, if not none. Here, this is a difference. This is in a different cathedral here. Here we have a smiling angel who clearly looks happy, despite that she's lost. Well, angels have neither male nor female, right? So to say this angel has lost one of its hands, but that's from the French Revolution, as undoubtedly the damage was done by riots, vandalizing, rioters, vandalizing this church. But they didn't destroy the sculpture. So we see some, this almost looks like someone saying, yeah, I don't care. So there's some actual emotion and expressions and movement and liveliness to these. This is an exception to the normal traditional Gothic sculpture, which is stiff, formal, and ramrod upright with no movement, little to no emotion, and very, I would say, unlifelike or lifeless even appearance. But here they have some more than you would expect. Okay, but you don't need to know where these are or anything about them, because they're not on the syllabus this semester. I took it off. All right, let's move on to the next must know. Did I give you guys a double break on this? I shouldn't have. Hang on, let's see. Virgin and Child and Throne. It's not this one, even though the title is very similar. So here's what I'm going to do. We are going to, by the way, see Sainte-Chapelle, the window, Gothic window, Gothic church, which is almost entirely glass. It's a remarkable building, but I didn't have a slide of it set aside. I was busy with all the grading and entering and forwarding grades. I didn't have a chance to add it. It's going to be a new slide. We'll see that next week. Okay, so some of you might have noticed we skipped over. It's the second from the bottom on week 14 last week. We'll see that next week. Okay, and it will be a must know. So there'll be notes on it. So In lieu of that, what I did was take this out and add Saint-Chapelle. So again, you don't have to take notes, just follow me here. There's a bit of unintended humor, and that isn't typical of Gothic sculpture. This is in a church I've seen it, in fact, it's in Strasbourg, which is the headquarters of the EU, or is that, anyway, it's just, international city on the border between France and Germany. And so it's a beautiful city, canals and beautiful wooden houses and great food and great wine. And their cathedral is quite nice. But this particular piece here above the central doorway is Romanesque era. And that has remember we covered Romanesque architecture 2 weeks ago, including sculpture, has the rounded arch, right? But the sculpture in the middle isn't a typical Romanesque either. So here's another exception to the rule, or, some, obviously different version of this style. What's happening is there is liveliness here. There's some movement, but when you look closely, this is the death of Mary. She's about to go to heaven, and Jesus, here he is, supposedly comes down from heaven. I don't even know if that's part of the Bible. I have no idea whether it's in the Bible, but this scene depicts this, the artist, the sculptor was trying to portray. The moment before Mary's soul rises up to heaven and God sends Jesus down to accompany her. And there he is, obviously her only son. But a couple of weird things about this. For instance, he's got a statue of himself, a miniature or baby Jesus in his own arms. That seems a little out, but I'm sure there's some, I've never found out, but some kind of symbolic purpose for that. And we have the other Mary, the one that was his disciple, Mary Magdalene, and that's nothing unusual. She's depicted in a lot of, you'll see her in paintings next week, Gothic paintings done by a famous Italian painter. It's on the syllabus, Giotto. So she's in a lot of sculpture and paintings about the death of Mary or the death of Jesus. So this is, after Jesus already died, gone to heaven. So this is his spirit manifesting itself. But here are the disciples. They're supposed to be still alive down on earth, right? And look at how every one of them looks. Don't they all look like the same person? Exactly the same. Beard, hairstyle, and even their expressions. That's one odd feature, besides the thing about Jesus carrying a miniature figure of himself. But my favorite unintended humorous detail here is this two people here. This is supposed to be one man and another one next to him, but it looks like this guy's holding the detached head of someone else, like that scene in Hamlet, if you know some of your Hamlet Shakespeare play. Alas, poor Yorick, right? It's just a skull in that scene, of course, being held by somebody who knew him. It disembodied head. It doesn't, in other words, compute or relate to the real, actual way a person would appear if they were standing in a group behind someone. In the foreground, of course, is Mary and two of the other disciples, and then Mary Magdalene. So it's just poorly done in terms of its depiction of depth and space, and also not very creative in terms of the features of the people. That's another aspect of medieval sculpture. They usually didn't get much feeling or emotion or lifelike quality in the facial features or the poses of their figures. Here the poses have a little more movement, but they're still more realistic than other Gothic. Actually, this is a Gothic sculpture added to a Romanesque church is what it is. But you don't have to know that. This one, though, yes, I'm not cutting this from the study list. This has a very colorful history, and I'll bet a few of you have heard something about it. It's our next must know. So it's on week 15. It's down the second one at the bottom of the page, okay? Cologne Cathedral. Okay, that's Cologne, Cathedral, Germany. Cologne is a city in Germany, as many of you know. Germany is the location, and the date is 1248. Or is it? Not exactly. So that's part of the mystery that I'll explain about this church. Right, the first thing to say is that it's the largest Gothic church in the world. Now, if you have friends from Italy, and I do, in Milan, where the largest Gothic church in Italy is, they'll fight you. Oh, they get mad when you say that. But the point is that church is bigger interior wise. The interior of this cathedral in Milan, Italy, it's really a famous Gothic. There aren't many Gothic churches in Italy. They didn't like this style, but a few of the northern cathedrals are. So in Milan, in northern Italy, you have a church that has a bigger interior. So it's the largest Gothic interior, but this is the largest Gothic. In fact, I've seen it written as a building, but let's just be more cautious and say the largest Gothic church in the world. There's no question. When those towers, which are 515 feet tall, you add the weight of those towers, the mass or volume, right, of them, and the weight, as well as the height, you definitely end up having to say, and there's your first fact you should have about the meaning of this, why it's such a unique site, is that it is the largest Gothic church on earth. Still is. No one's made anything bigger than this. The one in Washington, D.C. is almost as big, but not quite. Okay, and then we have the fact that it shouldn't be here. There's absolutely no logical explanation for why it wasn't bombed into rubble, or is there? Again, a mystery, I hope, kind of gets your curiosity up a bit. Why is everything around it? Look at this picture. All of these are modern buildings. Why? Because this whole city of Cologne, which was one of the biggest cities in Germany, is still not, I think it's the third largest city after Berlin and Munich, had all these factories and railroad bridges and railroad tracks. So of course, it was bombed to smithereens. My father went through there after the war, right after the surrender. And there was nothing higher than knee height, rubble everywhere, except for this church. This is not a replica. This is the original church. And that would beg the question, as part of the meaning, I think the most interesting fact about the meeting, how did it survive and why? So I'm going to see if anybody here has maybe just, there's, obviously not something that you could just guess at. But if anybody has any theory, why was this building spared? Because see, it was spared by the Allies. Obviously, they had to make a choice, a decision. The bomb.
Superstition?
Yeah, say it again.
Superstition? They didn't want to piss off God?
Now that's interesting because no one has said that before. So go ahead and explain that. Actually, that isn't quite it, but it isn't a bad guess because there are some other buildings that survived either World War I or World War II that were saved by some legends about them or something. So when you say that, how did you mean it in relation to the building itself?
Well, if the people who were also doing the bombing were religious and they saw this beautiful church, they wouldn't want to destroy it because they might think they would be like destroying the house of God, so they wouldn't want to make God angry.
That would be the case with some of the Italian, early Christian monuments in Italy, because of course Italy is where the Catholic Church, right? Not just Rome, obviously, but and maybe even some Roman relics were saved, like the Colosseum. Because of their history, I don't know if you would want to say superstition, but belief in the value. So in essence, you're saying that. That's a good guess, and it would have been a nice reason, but that isn't the reason. Let's give you one other clue, or anybody else want to take a step. It has to do with military strategy. Okay, look at the towers. They're 515 feet. They're the tallest structures anywhere.
Oh, did they want to save it for when they took control?
Well, someone started. Who was the other person started to chime in? Sorry.
They used the church as bombing landmarks.
Yes.
So they would go for the railroads and the stations and the bridges.
Exactly, a strategic sighting device or bombing guide. In other words, this church. Here's the facts you can write now. So those are all good guesses, but actually, it is the latest point that you just made. So to summarize it in a sentence, you can say the Allies decided to leave this church intact, to use it as a sighting device. That's the shortest way to say it, for their bombing raids, because it can be seen, the towers, of course, from 75 miles away. That part of Germany is flat. Been all over Germany. And have many friends in Germany, and those who live in this area in and near Cologne, say they have to be thankful for that because they guessed that. No one said that. It wasn't announced, of course, by the Allies. We're not going to bomb Cologne Cathedral, but people figured that out. And so they would rush into the church, and of course the doors were barred after it filled up, and a lot of people's lives were saved by that. Something I haven't mentioned before. So see, I forget who is it that gave the first. You're sorry, I can recognize your voice, but I don't see your names now that we have full screen share here. But anyway, both the first thought was actually not at all incorrect in a way, because there is some aspect of that, but the main reason was the military use of it as a sighting device for their bombers. Everything around it was flattened, including other churches, by the way, although they didn't deliberately target churches, except in Berlin. Berlin, all the churches in the center of Berlin, where there's one left standing in ruins. It's so famous. It's been, I don't know if you ever saw the Tom Hanks movie about the Bridge of Spies. Great movie, by the way. About Germany before the end of the Cold War. And here it is, the 1980s or early 90s, and there's still buildings sitting there in ruins in Berlin, which is sort of like a little lesson, right? A reminder, let's not do that again, go down that crazy path that we did in the 30s and 40s. So this was a purely military reason for not destroying it. Yeah. So it survived intact with only some minor, little damage here and there from shrapnel. Okay. And then one other interesting fact about it is that it wasn't finished in 1248. So here's the last fact about the meaning. What does that mean? Well, in 1248, let's get up close. This is where the towers ended. In fact, they didn't have the towers, right at where the base would be, where the towers were. In 1248, the church opened just like you see it, with these incredibly tall, by the way, these are the tallest flying buttresses. See, they go all the way up here. If you look, there's the top of them, coming off the side walls of the transept there. And they go around, all the way around to the back. So this was one of the largest, but not the largest Gothic church in the world. When it was initially opened in 1248, it did not have either tower. I think I've finally figured out the reason. I've been doing some reading. You could just say they ran out of the manpower, the labor. After all, this is the beginning of those plagues and things, in the mid 1200s. They started that early. They got worse in the 1300s. These massive plagues that killed, tens of millions of people. So between, the plagues and manpower, or you can say labor shortage, and maybe running out of funds, they just never finished the top part of the towers. So how did that happen? This is the last fact you should have the meaning, which is it's due to the founder of modern Germany. There was no nation of Germany in the mid 1800s, but a man named Bismarck, you may have heard of him. He was, in essence, the man who ran Germany for the first 30 years, even though he wasn't officially the Kaiser, they called him, which was a king, right? Till World War I, they had a period of time where they had a ruler who was a monarch. But the real power behind the throne was Bismarck, just like it sounds with a capital B, right? He decided to use the completion of these towers as a symbolic inspiration. You could say inspiration, symbolic, as an inspiration, a campaign to finish the towers of Cologne, to get the rest of Germany to unite behind him and to create the new nation. There was no Germany in 1848. There was about 30 different kingdoms that were all competing with each other. And so what happened was, by getting the entire population, or most, or just say a large part of the population of all these kingdoms to combine, to collaborate, however you want to say it, to cooperate, one of those words you should have in your notes, together, raising money. School children gave their lunch money. It's like the thing with the Statue of Liberty. Some of you know that. The money was raised in this country to build it. It was designed in France, but it still took a lot of money to put the pieces on a boat, get them over here and assemble them. That money came from contributions from all over the United States. So it's a similar idea. So this, of course, again, to finish up on the meaning here, this cathedral, the completion of the towers on this cathedral were used as a project to inspire the various kingdoms of Germany to unite into one country. And guess what? The date they were finished, 1870, is the year Germany became a country, was finally a unified nation. And that was all done by Bismarck. He was in essence the military head of the most powerful army in northern Germany. So he was the one that chose to do that, was his idea. And it seemed to have worked, because here it is, the church with its towers designed as they were originally. All right, let's then talk about the formal elements. I already mentioned the space, but I'll repeat this, that the towers are 515 feet tall, right? And then we have a nave that is 168 feet. It's the second tallest nave in Europe. That there aren't many taller than 140 feet. Notre Dame, right? And in Reims, we just saw, those are like 14-story skyscraper. It's could fit inside. Here, 168 feet means, you know, a 16-story skyscraper could fit. So again, the space, the real dimensions are the twin towers are 515 feet. And of course, again, one more time, the nave has a ceiling of 168 feet. Then we have the largest mass, obviously the towers. And then the central facade, no. On this one, you can see the transept, but it would be the nave. The nave is right, this whole central aisle that ends all the way back here. So the nave is the second largest. The towers are the largest masses. And then the third largest is the transept. So in this one, if you're going to talk about, if it's on the final, the formal elements, you would need to identify the masses if you choose to write about mass. And you need to use that word for the third largest mass, transept. I mentioned it last week. Transcpt. That's this section that crosses the nave. The material or textures are all real, and you can only see the two main textures here: real rough stone and real smooth glass on the windows, of course. Then we have the dynamic features. Well, they dominate, of course, the tall, and here we have really tapering spires and all the pointed arched, right? Windows. And let's go down below where we can see the tri-portal. You see, even though it's not a right, it's a Catholic cathedral, not anymore. Well, yeah, it still is. Yeah, that's right, it still is. Because you know, parts of Germany maintain their Catholic following, but other parts became Protestant after the Martin Luther King, who was a German, as you may know. Martin Luther King, not him. My apologies. Martin Luther, who Martin Luther King's name was taken from by his connection to the history of course, the Christian church. Not that one. Martin Luther, the guy that declared the Protestant religion, in essence. Most of Germany is not Catholic, but this part is. So here we have the three doors. That's part of the meaning if you choose to write about it, if it's on the essay part, or the final, the tri-portal. Those are all repeated shapes, of course, and dynamic. The only thing stable are the outer edges of the towers and the main walls. And then we have the modeling is, of course, always just the shadows from the sun, natural shadows. The lines are all carved. You can't see any painted lines. It would be on the stained glass windows if you want to say that, but you can't really see those, so you wouldn't have to write about that. And then let's see. Balance, yes, balance left to right, of course, is almost all Gothic churches, especially any ones with the twin towers and spires, as always. Symmetrical left to right, unbalanced toward the bottom. Let's see, I think I covered it. Oh, color. The color of the stone here is a dark gray. You can't tell that from this photo. So it would be a cool color. And this, it's hard to tell, but I think you can see that. In any case, you just write that and just make sure it's in your notes if it's on the essay part of the final. And this particular slide, I almost certainly won't cut from the study list. Okay, let's move on. Not that, that's for next semester. Okay, this one also has a misleading element in the color because the slide I own, when it got transferred by the slide librarian a year and a half or 2 years ago to digital format, for some reason the color didn't come through, but I can describe that. But this is a really remarkable church. It has 5 things, the 5 main facts about the meaning. Remember, you need 6 if you're going to write 6 sentences if it's on the essay part of the final. Each one is unique. There's no other church of any style or period like this building. Okay, so which one is it? It's the actually first one on the list for week 15 on this week's lecture on the syllabus, Salsbury Cathedral. And yes, it's spelled like the steak. It's a town, of course, in England. Salisbury, Salisbury Cathedral, England, 1330. So this is their second definition from that. Again, these are only one sentence definitions. decorated style. This is an example of English decorated style, but I shortened the definition to just because it is an English style of, here we go, of architecture. Okay, again, the decorated style is a style of late English Gothic churches. It's a style of late Gothic English churches. That's more accurate. I'll say it again. A style of late Gothic English churches, comma, in which ornately carved decorative stonework lines the facade. In which ornately carved decorative stonework lines the facade. Or you could just say is on the facade. Now, if you look closely, that only applies to the tower in this church, Salsbury. So as you might be able to tell from the definition I just gave you, the tower is in the decorated or late English decorated Gothic style. The rest of the church was, remember these things took, some of them 150, like this church took well over 100 years. It's like 120 years to finish. So the older parts of the building don't have those. Let's take a closer look. You can see the walls are pretty plain here, aren't they? But it is a basic, there's your flying buttresses, right? They're at the corners of the building. And then we have the pointed arch doors. Remember, that's always part of the meaning. Any slide on architecture is whatever features you can identify that mark it as that style will give you several of the facts you need to write, to analyze the meaning, if it's on the essay part of the exam. Also, this one I'm not going to cut. It's a pretty important slide. But there's a lot more to it than the fact that it's English decorated Gothic. That's nothing unique. There are dozens of these kind of churches all over England, if not maybe even a couple hundred. So it's not unique stylistically. What is unique, here we are, the features that mark this as a unique building, period, of any style, not just in the British Isles, but especially in Britain, is that it has the tallest tower in Great Britain, 405 feet tall. That spire is as tall and tapering as you can get, isn't it? It gets so narrow, it's almost looks like it could break off if it was hit by a flock of birds or something. Well, guess what? You see where the arrow is? See that round thing? That is also the second thing about this church that marks it as unique. It's got the first airplane warning light ever used in the British Isles, or you could just say Great Britain. The first airplane warning light. Well, this was finished in 1920, not the tower, but that light. Planes were just beginning to be used by private, right, citizens in the 1920s. So it's really early. And it's been there, what is it now, 100 years. And no plane has ever crashed into this church tower. You might think, well, why would they? Well, hey, it gets foggy in England. And of course, in the winter, there's a lot of clouds and, low cloud cover. And of course, easily there could have been an accident. And the tower is so tall, it's the tallest thing for, several counties, way, for 100 miles in each direction. This is way outside of London, by the way. So yeah, they needed that airplane warning light, and they thought ahead. These people were, whoever designed the bishop, I assume, the fact that they had thought ahead to say, well, planes might, those new flying machines might crash into it. So it's got, again, the oldest installed, you can say continuously used airplane warning light in the British Isles in Great Britain. Another thing is it has a double transept. So that word you do kind of need to know. One way or the other, it could be helpful on one of the Gothic slides if they're on the essay part of the final. And that means there's the nave, right? That goes all the way past where we can't see the far end of it be out here. But then two of these arms crossing the nave at a right angle, which is the definition of the transept, it's got two of them. Now, that's rare. There are a few other churches like that, but this has the most obvious, massive, you could say largest double transept. The reason for it is the tower is so heavy. It's so massive, not only in height, but width and the thickness of the walls on the tower that make it so heavy that it needs extra support. So the two transepts help support the tower. So that's your third unique feature. Then you've got this down here. That is the most intact, or just say the oldest complete or intact wall around any cathedral yard. Again, in the British Isles, if not in all of Europe. And it's really unusual that it survived. It was made by hand by monks, of course, who were, guarding the church and keeping, the property that where the arrow is the yard that the church owns, of course, keeping that area intact. There have been no modern buildings put into the yard. Now that might seem like, what's the big deal? But if you go to see Gothic churches all over Europe or anywhere, even some of the older churches back east in this country, whatever the style, if they have a yard, usually there's some kind of modern something on that yard, at least a guard shack or something, if not a souvenir shop or offices, or even sometimes they subdivide the yards and sell off parts of the land to make money for the church to maintain the building and so forth, pay salaries. They didn't do that. They kept the yard and the wall around it intact, and that's the only example of that in all, again, of the British Isles. So again, the fourth feature is the original wall intact. The original wall from the 1300s encloses the original yard with no alterations. I mean, obviously some of the trees have died and they've been new trees planted. Other than that, there's no changes. But my favorite unique feature, the fifth one, that marks this as totally the unique site. It has the oldest working clock in the world on the wall of the nave. It is from the early 1300s and it's still working. So it's now 700 years it's been functioning. Now, it isn't like any modern clock. It has pulleys and weights and ropes, and the numbers are Roman numerals. You have to write all that. Just say it's a medieval clock made out of wood and metal and ropes. The ropes have weights. I mean, it's a very early primitive form of a clock, but it works. They have to rewind it, I think, every few days. But the point is, it's been functioning continually, keeping time since the early 1300s, 700 years. So it is, again, last time, to repeat the last fact about the meaning, this church has the oldest working clock in the world, not just Great Britain. So you see why this church is so popular. You could add one more fact, and we'll do the form analysis. With artists, this is probably the most popular church for painters, landscape painters from all over Europe. And not just the Impressionists. Some of them came here to paint this church because the setting and the surrounding and the history is so unique and so beautifully preserved. And all kinds of English painters, famous English painters. So if you take art 1.2 or 2.3, you'll probably see a slide or two, depending on who you take the course from, of this church. Some of them from across the river. I mean, it hasn't changed. The exterior and the setting has not changed in 700 years. Okay, so again, what makes it Gothic, we've covered already with the fly buttresses, the pointed arch doors and windows, the tall tapering spire, of course. And then the rose window isn't as obvious. You have to walk around here to see it around the side, but there is one. It's a smaller rose window, round window, which is, right above the main doors, because this is where you would enter the church, at the bottom of this, which is the nave. So it does have a rose window, and it has those Gothic groin vaults on the ceiling. Okay, so let's do the formal analysis. Okay, this is for space. The tower I already mentioned. I'll repeat. The height of the tower is one of the two dimensions you should have in your notes, and that's 405 feet. The nave is only 110 feet tall. That's not very tall. It's not, short by any means, but it's not one of the taller naves in Europe. 110-foot high ceilings. Okay, and then we have the largest mass of that, should be clear. It's the tower, so massive. And then it's balanced. If you stood here and looked up and the two transepts, it's completely symmetrical, balance on either side. And if you stood here and looked at it from this angle, with the transepts, coming out of the sides of the nave and the tower right dead center in the middle of the building, it's symmetrical no matter how you look at it, from any angle, left to right. And of course, as usual with these churches, unbalanced toward the bottom. Now the color you can't see here, it's a light yellow colored stone. So even though this makes it look bluish purple, you see, on my computer screen, my laptop, I can't tell from you guys whether you see it that way, but I'm assuming you can't see the yellowish color of the stone, but having been there twice, I can tell you it's a warm yellow color stone, which is a popular color for Gothic churches. The textures of the real rough texture of stone, and real smooth texture of tiles on the roof and glass in the windows. The rhythm is obvious with the flying buttresses, the spires. By the way, these are called finials, these little miniature spires. At every corner, you've got these. So that creates rhythm. And of course, all the pointed arches in the windows and doors. And those are the dynamic features, the tall tapering spire, of course, the flying buttresses and the pointed arch doors and windows. The stable features, again, are the edges or corners of the walls and the lower part of the tower. The rhythm is also repeated up here, and this is your decorated. You see that here, how it works there with every part of this tower up until you get to the spire. And even then, every few feet or several feet, there's more carved, decorated English Gothic detailing. Okay, so that creates rhythm, of course. The modeling, as usual, is just the natural shadows from the sun. The line is carved. Here, you can't really see any painted line. And I think it covered the textures. Yeah, space. Okay, balance. Yeah, I think we covered everything. All right, we're in good shape to end early tonight. Well, this one also has an interesting history and a more recent connection. Diana, as in the one who was killed in the tragic crash, in the tunnel in Paris, her funeral was held here. That's one of the reasons this is well known. Another one is Tom Hanks. I'll explain that in a minute. Okay, so this is the next must know, and it is the Chapel of Henry VII. Chapel of Henry VII. Now, Henry, of course, is just like it sounds, Henry, and seventh, remember, is Roman numerals. But if you wrote the numeral 7, I would give you credit, because that's how most people these days write the number 7. But when you're talking about kings and queens, you almost always want to use the traditional method, and it is in the syllabus, of the Roman numerals for 7, which is, of course, capital VII. So again, Chapel of Henry VII. Location, London, the date, 1516. Henry VII, don't confuse him with Henry VIII. And if you write Chapel of Henry VIII, you get no credit for that part of your answer, because there's nothing to do with Henry VIII, that monster that had 4 of his wives, well, actually 3 of them killed and 1 imprisoned, and the other 2, were not exactly treated well. Yeah, that Henry VIII, the one with 6 wives, this is his father. And he was the first Tudor king. This is all part of the meaning now. So Henry VII founded the Tudor, Tudor. You might know that word already. It was a TV series called The Tudors. It's pretty well done on, I think, Netflix about 10 years ago. Anyway, so the Tudors, they're their most famous dynasty. There's no question. They're the most famous dynasty in the history of the British Isles, because they were so colorful, every one of them. I already mentioned Henry VIII, and there's Elizabeth, right? And in between was Bloody Mary, they called her. Yes, the drink was named after her. I think she was a cousin of Elizabeth, who preceded Elizabeth. Yeah, and then you had this guy. So let's say it again, just to keep it to specific facts. If it's on the essay part, the final, you'd want to say that this chapel was built by, not designed by, but ordered to be built. So just say built by Henry VII, who was A, the founder of the Tudor dynasty, and B, the father of Henry VIII. But that's where there's any connection ends. He was not like his son. He did not abuse, well, every king had abused their power. I mean, that's almost a given with monarchies, right? But the point is, he was not cruel. He was not precipitous or capricious, is a good word, in abusing people in his own family or his own household. He won a war, a 30 years war. It took 30 years for him to capture the throne from some enemy families. And he won that. And that's how the Tudor dynasty was founded. So he had this, the bottom line of why it was have to do with this chapel, besides that he ordered to be built. The reason he ordered this chapel, Henry VII, to be built was to thank God, quote unquote, as in, the quote, higher power that he would have called God, right? So he literally said, I want to give thanks to God for letting me become victorious, for helping me. He believed God was on his side, of course. And therefore, I will build this chapel in God's honor. So it took many years to complete, and it finished in time for him to enjoy the use of it as a private chapel for him and his family and their invited guests. It has since become a tourist site, as well as, this is all part of the meaning, a scene or site for the many royal events, particularly funerals. And one of those, again, I said just a few minutes ago, but if you didn't write it then, you might want to add this to your meaning notes, is that this particular chapel was the site of the funeral service or eulogy. It wasn't the entire funeral that was held here. They went all over London with their bodies. Some of you have heard, I was before most of you were born, right? 1998. Anyway, it got 2 billion people watched that because she was so popular. With so many people. In any case, it was a world broadcast live all over the world. So it was a world event. There's no other way to say it. With 2 billion people watching, and they all saw her casket. Of course, it was an open casket. Her casket was inside this chapel. Okay, so that event was held there, as were other royal events, particularly other funerals. And no coronations were held here, though. That's not done here. That's done in the main church. It's in the back, as the last fact about the meaning. The back of this, or one of the last two, I'm sorry, this is a chapel added to the back of Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey is the cathedral where all of the kings of England have been crowned for hundreds of years, like 800 years. So just saying it was a chapel added onto the back of the main cathedral where kings were crowned, and it wasn't used for coronations. It was used for funerals and other royal events, as well as now it's open to the public. And yes, what did Tom Hanks have to do with it? I don't know if anybody saw the film version of the Da Vinci Code where he plays the main character. There's a scene where he's trying to, figure out some puzzle. That's what the whole book and the movie are about, right? Is he some kind of symbologist, I think they call him, where he's trying to figure out the meaning of all these strange clues. And they have a scene filmed inside here because it was in the book. They mentioned this chapel. It's very popular. Millions of tourists a year come through here. Okay, and then the very last fact about the meeting I did want to make sure I don't overlook is the last new definition, and this is mercifully short. Here we go for tonight. And that's perpendicular style. Just like it sounds, but I'll spell that word because it's on your handout, but you should be writing it on the handout with the blank lines below each definition. But if not, and you're writing it separately, here we go. That word is perpendicular, perpendicular style. Okay, here we go. It's a style of late Gothic English architecture. And here we go from circa 1450, so it's very late, to 1550. So just that last century, circa 1450 to 1550, comma, in which the main ornaments are along perpendicular arranged. Sorry, the main ornaments are arranged along parallel perpendicular lines, period. Again, I'll repeat that. It's a style of late Gothic English architecture from circa 1450 to 1550, comma, in which the main ornaments are arranged along perpendicular lines. Well, look at the windows. You see that is perpendicular detailing, but even down on the lower walls, when you get down to where, yeah, there you go. See that? The carved stonework and these decorations, they're in between perpendicular lines. They're arranged along those perpendicular lines. And even the choir stalls, that's where the young boys' choirs, seems to be always young boys that sing in these churches, at least in England. I've seen a choir performance in this church or this chapel. Those are perpendicular style too. They're carved wood, but they have these parallel lines. And of course, each set of ornament above each seat for each child who sings there. And hopefully, actually, they're not supposed to sit. They're supposed to stand the whole time. It could be 2 hours before they get to sit down. Anyway, they have above their heads these perpendicular decorations. And if you care about the flags or curious about them, you don't have to write this. But these are the flags of various noble families who backed the winner, right? Who sided with Henry VII and the Tudors to help them take power in that 30-year war. So now those are new versions of the flags of these various you know, they're not royal. Remember, royal means the king and his family. So they're noble families, right? You know, rulers, dukes, right? And so forth over different counties throughout England. And of course, those families, many of them still use these flags, but just purely for decorative purposes. They don't have any government power anymore. It's Parliament does that. Okay, so let's talk about the formal elements, and we'll then I'll stick around a few minutes to answer any questions people have after this last must-know slide for tonight. Okay, for space, it is very, very misleading. No one gets it right. I have been through this chapel, I think it's 4 times since my first trip to England. Maybe it's 3. Anyway, several times. And every time I go, there's a tour guide speaking in, of course, mostly in English since it's in England. And they'll ask people, how high do you think the ceiling is? People will say, oh, the least out here is 50. Most people say 60, 70 feet. It's only 36 feet high. It's deliberately distorted by the perpendicular ornament. That's why they use that style, why it was invented, is to make a less tall space appear taller or higher than it really is. So it works beautifully. So how do you write that in the first of the elements on space for your formal analysis? It is that the actual height of the ceiling is under 40 feet. I think it's like 36 or 38. It's between 35 and 40 feet. So just say under 40 feet, though it appears to be much taller. So that's the real space. There isn't, you know, you don't need to worry about the width. I don't even know. It's narrow, but you don't need to write about that. Okay, the largest mass, it would be the ceiling if you could see it. I'm sorry, this slide, the one the slide librarian found for me, you can't see the ceiling. The ceiling is really ornate, massive decorative features hanging down like dripping candle wax. It's very ornate. So the ceiling has more mass and weight than the floor, but the floor is clearly the same width. So the floor is the second largest mass. And then it's probably depends on how you divide it. Maybe the windows, if you count them as a single mass, and then the fourth largest would be the lower walls, which are the solid part of the outside or exterior. Okay, and then we have the rhythm, of course, of the perpendicular windows themselves and the decorations above and below, at the top and bottom, I should say, of each window and along the wall, and of course the choir stalls. Those are all Gothic perpendicular style ornament. The textures are real smooth tile on the floor, real smooth stone. This stone is quite smooth on the inside, real smooth glass, and then real rough wood. Those are the 4 main textures. All real, of course, no simulated textures visible here. The line is carved wherever you can see it here. There is some visual line around the edges of the windows, so you can say both, but most of the line you can see along the top of each window and in the wall and the wooden choir stalls. Those are all carved lines. Okay, the colors are warm only on the choir stall. Well, actually, this is a kind of a yellow stone. That's true. It is. So there's 2 sections of warm colors. The lower walls, the yellow stone part of the walls, and then the wood, of course, dark brown color of the choir stalls. It's cool on the blue and white tiles on the floor and on the windows. These are not stained glass. These are just, regular glass that have a slightly blue tint, but that makes them, of course, cool, as is the rest. Above the lower walls, all the stone is gray. So that's all cool colors. It's completely symmetrical, totally balanced left to right, and I would say top to bottom if you draw the line across the middle, both ways. And then let's see, perpendicular is more stable. That's the windows than usual Gothic windows, but they do curve upward into a point, as all true Gothic architecture does. And the doors are pointed arched. So those are the dynamic details. And the choir stalls, at least the upper decorations. The rest of the choir stalls are just flat, upright, of course, perpendicular wood paneling, and the windows themselves, as well as the floor, of course, are all stable. And the modeling is just the shadows from the sun. And let's see, I think we've covered it all. So let's see, I just wanted to go ahead for a second. I'm not going to do another slide, but yeah, we will cover some of this, next week. We actually have to go back. So next week we will, since I promised you to end early, and I said that'd be the last slide, we will go back to couple of slides that we skipped over, just this one actually. I really should do it this week. I think I should because, well, no, let's do it this way. We'll end extra early tonight. Next week we'll end probably about 30 or 40 minutes early. Tonight we're ending about, right? Almost an hour and a half early. Yeah. But this is an important one. It's on the syllabus. Some of you may notice the vaulted ceiling of Amiens Cathedral. We did cover it. We'll just go back, do that quickly, and then go forward next week to where we left off, which will be the late Gothic, 2 more architecture slides, and then the rest is Gothic painting and sculpture. And those, either one of those 2 topics might come up on the slide ID, possibly slide ID section, or even the painting could be the most important painting next week. It is really an important one by Giotto, which is the Lamentation, and that one we'll finish with that, and that'll be a really important one I won't cut for the study list. So hopefully you'll all be here for that, and then we'll do the review and my own slides of Notre Dame Cathedral 2 weeks from tonight. And the test, remember, the final is 3 weeks from tonight. And remember, it's not cumulative, right? It's only everything after the midterm. And then the other thing to remember about it, it's exactly the same format and the same amount of time allotted for it, which means, remember, there are 2 things about that. One is that we'll start at 6:45. So hopefully if you check in a little late, you try to get it logged on by a little before 6:45. And then I leave the slides on for a whole hour. And then it's recorded, of course, so you'll also be able to go back and check your work, or if you can't be there for some reason during the exam, it'll be on YouTube for 48 hours from Thursday night, or let's say 12:01 a.m. Friday. So just say all the way through Friday and Saturday. So you'll have till midnight on Saturday. And then I need to start grading them on Sunday after exams week. And that's the week your final extra credit is due for everybody. I will accept extra credit. I've decided I'll send you guys an email, maybe 2 even, to remind you. I think the syllabus said it had to be done by the 23rd, but I decided to give you the end of that week. So up until the day the finals are submitted, you'll still have the option of extra credit to add up to your point totals. Remember, it's up to 50 points. If no one's done anything close, I think the biggest amount anyone's done is 20 or 25 points. So many people could still add to their total points and give themselves a little margin for error, or a little cushion for their final grade. All right, does anybody have any questions about anything we've covered tonight, or anything about extra credit or your papers? Again, I apologize to those that didn't get their papers back, but I certainly will be able to get those to you. Oh yeah, I'm sure I will. In fact, I did find out just before class started. I did check my voicemail, and there's a message from that reader. So it should be this weekend. It should be by, I think Sunday at the very latest, hopefully more like Friday evening, that I can get you your, if you didn't get your paper back already, but you turned it in on time, should have it by the end of this week in your inbox. Okay, and then of course, anytime you want to know your grade, you can email me and ask me for your point totals, and then I can tell you not only what grade that would get you at this point, but if you want me to, how many more points do you need to get an A in the class? Obviously, I'd be happy to do that confidentially by email. Okay, I think I've covered all the main announcements. Anybody have any questions about anything that we've covered? Your grades, extra credit, or papers? Remember, you can still turn in late papers, but I wouldn't wait till right before the final. That doesn't give you much time, and it would eat into your time to prepare and study for the final itself, of course, which is the exact same number of slides, 8 slides plus 1 extra credit at the end, optional, just like the midterm was. Same amount of time, same worth, the same points, 100 points, which of course is equal to the weight of the midterm. So if you didn't do well on either one of those 2 tests, you could still recover the missing points. Most of them, we're up to 50 anyway, with all the extra credit options. That's why I made those available to everybody. Okay, well, we've, I think, covered everything tonight, and so we'll wrap up with Gothic slides of Gothic art and painting, sculpture, and architecture next week. All right, and one more time, anybody have any questions or comments or any information they still would need from tonight? Anybody? Nope. Okay. Thank you, guys. Thank you all. And thank you for your participation for the people that came up with those comments. It always makes it more interesting. Okay. All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good
Yeah,
night.
take care. Thanks.
Thank you.
See you next week. Have a good weekend. Take care.